Listen closely, because something is changing in this very moment. If you can truly sense it, if it lands deep enough, the way you experience reality may start to shift in ways you never expected. There is already a version of you that exists beyond doubt and hesitation. That version is living with abundance, moving with clarity, and making decisions from a place of calm certainty. It doesn't wait for life to approve it, it simply knows. And that knowing is not far away in time. It is already present, already formed, already available for you to step into from this very point. The problem is, most people are taught to look for wealth in the wrong place. They measure it through numbers, balances, income, and external results. So they constantly check, compare, and evaluate themselves against what they see outside. Without realizing it, they start letting those numbers define their limits. But those numbers were never the source. They are the reflection. What you believe about yourself quietly produces the outcomes you see. Identity comes first, and everything external simply follows that internal blueprint you are living from every day. If wealth were only about access, education, or opportunity, then the majority of people would already be wealthy. But reality shows something different. Some people rise from very little and build extraordinary lives, while others, with every advantage, still struggle to hold on to stability. The difference is not just effort, it is inner alignment. Wealth is not simply something you obtain, it is something you embody. It shows up in how you think when nobody is watching, how you choose when there is uncertainty, and how you carry yourself when nothing around you has changed yet. Now consider something uncomfortable but important. Who do you believe you are when nothing in your environment confirms your success? That answer quietly shapes everything. If deep down you see yourself as someone who is always trying, always waiting, always almost there, then even when real opportunities appear, you hesitate, you question yourself, you delay action. Not because you are incapable, but because your inner identity is not yet aligned with the life you say you want. And that misalignment creates resistance in your decisions without you even noticing it. But the moment your internal identity begins to shift, even slightly, everything about your behavior starts to change with it. You begin to act with more certainty without forcing it. Decisions become quicker, clearer. You stop asking for constant reassurance and start trusting your direction. The question of "can I?" slowly gets replaced with a quiet assumption of course I can. And what feels subtle at first eventually becomes your new normal. You don't become wealthy by waiting to feel ready. You begin to feel ready first, and that feeling starts reorganizing how you move through life. Your mind is always trying to stay consistent with the identity you repeatedly accept. If you hold the belief, "I am not there yet," your mind will constantly search for evidence that supports delay. If you say, "I am becoming," it will keep you in a state of waiting. But when you shift into a deeper knowing, when you feel "this is who I am," something powerful activates. You start noticing what you previously ignored. You speak with more assurance. You carry yourself differently. And others can sense that shift, even if they cannot explain it. At first, nothing outside will seem to change. That is where most people get discouraged. But that delay is actually the test. Can you remain steady in the new identity while the external world is still catching up? If you can hold that state without reverting back, you stop reacting to life and start influencing the direction of it. Gradually, your perception changes. You begin recognizing possibilities that were always there, but previously invisible to you because your identity was filtering them out. There is a deeper truth here that most people overlook. The version of you who already has what you desire is not something you need to build from scratch. It is not far away in the future. It already exists in potential right now, just beyond the limitations of how you currently define yourself. The real shift is not about becoming someone entirely new. It is about letting go of the false layers you have accepted, doubt, hesitation, and the repeated story that says you are not ready yet. Instead of constantly trying to add more to yourself, the real transformation comes from releasing what is not true. When you remove the belief that you are behind or lacking, what remains is clarity. And in that clarity, recognition begins. You stop striving and start noticing. Your mind accepts familiarity more easily than effort, so when something feels known internally, it integrates faster than anything you force. That is why alignment feels calm, while resistance feels heavy. Over time, this shift becomes visible in your life. You notice yourself reacting differently, setting higher standards, and no longer tolerating what once felt normal. Eventually, the feeling of trying disappears completely. It is replaced by a quiet sense of arrival. Not because everything is perfect, but because you no longer feel disconnected from who you are. So the real question becomes this: what if the life you have been chasing was never outside of you, but simply waiting for you to remember who you already are? Close your eyes for a moment and imagine waking up with that quiet certainty inside you. No resistance, no questioning, no inner argument pulling you in different directions. Just a steady, grounded awareness that this is you. Notice how different that feels compared to the usual mental noise. That feeling is not something far away or imaginary. It is a hint, a subtle recognition of something already present within you. And the more you return to it, the more you trust it, the less you find yourself chasing a future version of your life, because you begin to recognize that the state you were looking for was never missing. Now consider something most people never question. What if what you are looking at right now is already old? Not in a dramatic sense, but in a simple, practical way. Your current results, your circumstances, even your financial situation, they feel immediate and final, but they are actually delayed expressions of earlier thoughts, earlier beliefs, earlier decisions. What you are seeing today is not who you are in this moment. It is who you were thinking as before. And this is where everything begins to shift. Because if your present reality is only an echo of a previous state, then reacting to it emotionally only strengthens what created it in the first place. Most people treat their current situation as absolute truth. They look at their life and assume it is a fixed statement about their identity. But it is not a verdict. It is a reflection, a leftover impression of old inner patterns playing out in physical form. Every thought you held consistently yesterday shaped the direction you moved in. Those actions took time to unfold, which means what you are experiencing now is simply the result arriving late, not the cause being created right now. And that realization changes everything about how you interpret your life. If your current reality is delayed, then what you are becoming internally in this moment is already shaping what will appear next. That means your identity today is not just a response to your past, it is the starting point of your future. And this is where most people unconsciously repeat their cycle. They look at what is happening, decide nothing is changing, feel discouraged, and instantly slip back into the same thoughts and emotions that created those results. Without realizing it, they reinforce the exact pattern they want to escape. But the moment you create separation between yourself and what you see, something powerful happens. You stop merging with appearances. You stop treating external conditions as personal definitions. You begin to observe instead of absorb. And in that space, you gain the ability to choose differently. Even if nothing around you shifts immediately, something within you does. You can face the same situation, but no longer interpret it as proof of limitation. You can remain in the same environment, but no longer feel defined by it. There is always a gap between inner change and outer reflection. In that gap, doubt becomes louder. It questions everything. It tries to pull you back into familiar thinking patterns by suggesting nothing is working. But that voice is not truth. It is repetition. It is the echo of an older identity trying to stay in control. If you stay steady through that phase, something begins to build underneath what you can see. It is subtle at first, almost invisible, but it is real. Over time, as you stop reacting and start holding a different inner position, your external experience begins to respond. Not instantly, not dramatically, but gradually. You start noticing openings where there were none before. Conversations change, timing shifts, unexpected opportunities appear, not because they suddenly arrived, but because you are finally aligned enough to notice and act on them. And this is the part most people misunderstand about change. It is not about forcing new outcomes through repetition of words or empty affirmations. It is about the internal agreement behind those words. When something is said without belief, it carries contradiction. The surface sounds confident, but the deeper layer resists it, and that resistance cancels the signal. The mind does not respond to language alone, it responds to certainty. And certainty is not loud or forced. It is quiet, steady, and internally consistent. It feels like something you already know without needing to prove it. You have experienced this before in small moments, when you just knew something without explanation and acted without hesitation. That same quality is what creates alignment when it becomes your dominant internal state. When your inner system fully accepts something as true, your behavior begins to reorganize around it naturally. You stop trying to act differently and start acting differently without effort. Choices feel clearer, movement feels lighter, And slowly, the life you once tried to reach begins to feel like something you are simply stepping into, not chasing anymore. Confidence feels normal when you are aligned with it. Movement starts to feel lighter, less forced, almost natural. But there is something most people never really notice. The very first moment of certainty is not something that arrives on its own. It is chosen. It does not depend on circumstances. It does not wait for evidence. It begins the moment you allow yourself to fully experience it before anything outside of you confirms it. And at first, that can feel unfamiliar, even slightly uncomfortable, because you are stepping away from an identity you have repeated for a long time. But that discomfort is not a warning. It is actually a sign that you are entering new ground mentally and emotionally. You are no longer operating from the old pattern automatically. You are interrupting it. And in that interruption, something new becomes possible. Imagine speaking the same words you have always said, but this time you are not rushing through them. You slow down, you let them land, you allow the meaning to actually register instead of just passing through your mind. And in that space, something shifts internally. A calm settles in, not excitement, not pressure, but a quiet sense of certainty that does not need validation. And that is where real change begins, not on the surface, but underneath it. It does not immediately transform your external world, but it reshapes the internal direction everything flows from. Once that inner state is set in motion, the outer experience eventually follows, not randomly, but as a reflection of what has already changed within you. So the key is not repetition for the sake of repetition, it is presence, it is meaning, it is allowing a single moment of truth to actually be felt instead of just spoken. So understand this clearly. Wealth, success, and expansion were never hidden in external numbers or conditions. Those are just outcomes. The real foundation has always been identity, the way you see yourself when nothing is confirming it, the way you choose when nothing is guaranteed. And what you have been calling becoming is actually a process of remembering something that was already there, beneath all the doubt and conditioning. Your current reality is not a fixed statement about you. It is a delayed reflection of earlier inner patterns. And once you see that, you stop treating your present circumstances as absolute truth. You start seeing them as feedback, not as limitations, but as echoes of what has already passed through your mind and attention over time. That understanding alone creates space because it removes the pressure of believing everything you see is final. Instead, you begin to recognize that change starts internally first, and everything else follows that shift. From here, the direction is simple, but not always easy. You either return to the familiar pattern of reacting, doubting, and repeating the old identity, or you begin holding a new one quietly, without needing instant proof. Not forcing it, not performing it, but allowing it to become your baseline, and in doing so, your thoughts begin to organize differently. Your actions become more aligned without effort. Your decisions start coming from clarity instead of hesitation. And this is the turning point most people never fully step into. The moment where seeking stops and embodiment begins. No more waiting for permission. No more postponing change into some distant future version of yourself. Just a steady recognition of who you are choosing to be now. And if you stay with that recognition long enough, it stops feeling like imagination. It starts feeling like truth. Because when inner certainty becomes consistent, outer reality eventually adjusts to match it. Not instantly, not dramatically, but inevitably. And what once felt far away begins to feel natural, then familiar, and finally normal. That is how identity reshapes experience from the inside out, quietly, steadily, and completely. Identity is not just how you describe yourself. It is how you assume yourself to be at the deepest level, especially when no one is watching and nothing is forcing you to think differently. Most people believe their life is shaped by external conditions, but in reality, those conditions are shaped by an inner pattern that runs silently in the background. That pattern is identity. It is the collection of assumptions you accept about who you are, what you deserve, and what is normal for you. When someone repeatedly sees themselves as limited, struggling, or still trying, that identity becomes the filter through which every decision is made. Even small choices get influenced by it. The way you respond to opportunities, the way you handle uncertainty, and even the way you interpret silence or delay in your life all come from that internal sense of self. It is not always conscious. In fact, most of it runs automatically, without you actively thinking about it. This is why two people can face similar circumstances but end up in completely different outcomes. It is not only about effort or intelligence, it is about who they are being internally while taking action. One person may act from the identity of someone who is uncertain and waiting for confirmation, while another acts from the identity of someone who already assumes success is natural for them. The actions may look similar on the surface, but the internal energy behind them is completely different. Identity is also what determines your emotional reactions. When something goes wrong, the mind does not just process the event itself, it immediately compares it to your self-image. If your identity is fragile or rooted in lack, even small setbacks feel like proof of failure. But if your identity is stable and rooted in certainty, the same situation feels temporary, manageable, and not defining. The event does not change, but your interpretation of it does. What most people miss is that identity is not fixed. It is learned and reinforced over time. Every repeated thought, every emotional reaction, every conclusion you accept about yourself strengthens a certain version of who you believe you are. And once something is repeated enough, it feels like truth, even if it was never questioned deeply in the first place. This is how people unconsciously live inside identities that no longer match what they truly want. The interesting part is that identity does not need external proof to change. It shifts internally first. The moment you begin to consistently assume a different version of yourself, even before circumstances support it, something subtle starts to reorganize. Your attention begins to move differently. You start noticing different possibilities. You respond to situations in a slightly new way. At first, these changes are small enough to ignore, but they are real. When someone says, "I am a multimillionaire from today," the real power is not in the words themselves. It is in the identity behind those words. If those words are spoken as a hope, they carry no force. But if they are spoken as an inner assumption, something already accepted within consciousness, then they begin to influence perception. Not because reality changes instantly, but because the person interpreting reality has changed internally. Identity also determines what feels normal. This is extremely important. What you believe is normal for you becomes your comfort zone, even if it is not what you want. If struggle feels normal, then ease feels suspicious. If lack feels familiar, then abundance feels unrealistic at first. This is why change often feels uncomfortable in the beginning. It is not because the new identity is wrong, but because it is unfamiliar. So when someone begins to shift identity, they often face internal resistance. The mind tries to pull them back to what feels known. Old thoughts appear more frequently. Doubt becomes louder, not because something is going wrong, but because the system is trying to restore familiarity. If a person mistakes this phase as failure, they return to their old identity. But if they understand it as transition, they stay steady long enough for the new identity to settle. Over time, identity shapes behavior without force. You do not need to constantly remind yourself how to act. It becomes natural. Decisions align more easily because they are coming from a different internal baseline. You stop overthinking simple choices. You stop questioning your worth before acting. You begin to move in a way that feels consistent with a different version of yourself, even if nothing external has fully caught up yet. This is also where perception begins to change. The same environment does not feel the same anymore. Opportunities that were always there start to stand out more clearly. Conversations feel different. Your reaction to problems becomes calmer. Not because life has suddenly improved, but because the identity interpreting life has shifted. Identity does not work like imagination alone. It works through repetition and emotional acceptance. The more consistently you accept a version of yourself internally, the more your mind treats it as the default reference point. Once something becomes the default, it no longer feels like effort. It feels like who you are. This is why lasting change is not about forcing behavior, but about changing the inner assumption behind behavior. When identity changes, everything built on top of it begins to shift naturally. It is not an instant transformation in the external world, but a gradual alignment where your inner state and outer experience begin to match over time, quietly and steadily. Inner assumption is the quiet belief you hold about something before there is any proof of it in your outer world. It is not something you announce loudly or always notice consciously. It sits beneath your thoughts and quietly shapes how you interpret everything that happens to you. Most people think they respond to life directly, but in reality they are responding to their assumptions about life, and those assumptions are formed internally long before any external evidence appears. When we talk about inner assumption creating outer results, we are really talking about a simple but often overlooked process. You assume something to be true about yourself or your life, and that assumption influences your thoughts, your decisions, and your emotional reactions. Over time, those repeated patterns of thinking and reacting turn into consistent behavior, and behavior eventually produces visible outcomes. Nothing appears instantly, but everything begins internally before it becomes external. For example, if a person quietly assumes that opportunities are rare for them, they will not always say it out loud, but it will still influence their actions. They may hesitate when something new appears. They may doubt themselves before trying. They may overanalyze situations instead of stepping forward. From the outside, it may look like circumstances are holding them back, but internally, it is the assumption that opportunities are limited that is guiding their behavior. On the other hand, someone who assumes that opportunities are natural and accessible will behave differently in the same situation. They may still feel uncertainty at times, but their default response is more open. They are more willing to try, more willing to explore, and less likely to overthink every possibility. The external world is not immediately different for them, but their internal interpretation of it is. Inner assumption is powerful because it operates before logic fully steps in. Even when you try to think positively, your deeper assumption can still override surface-level thoughts. This is why people can repeat affirmations but still feel unchanged. If the inner assumption contradicts the words being spoken, the assumption usually wins. The mind trusts what feels real more than what is simply repeated. What makes inner assumption so important is that it quietly determines what you expect from life. Expectation is not always conscious. You may walk into situations already assuming how they will go based on past experiences or repeated beliefs. If you expect rejection, you behave differently than if you expect acceptance. If you expect struggle, you prepare for difficulty even before it arrives. These expectations influence your tone, your energy, your timing, and your decisions. Over time, the world begins to reflect those patterns back to you, not because it is reacting to your words, but because it is responding to your consistent behavior. If your assumption is stable, your behavior becomes predictable. And when behavior is predictable, results also become predictable. This is how inner assumptions slowly turn into outer conditions. What most people do not realize is that assumptions feel natural. You do not question them because they feel like truth. If you have assumed something about yourself for a long time, it stops feeling like a belief and starts feeling like reality itself. That is why change can feel difficult at first. You are not just changing actions, you are changing what feels normal inside your mind. When someone begins to shift their inner assumption, there is usually a phase where external reality does not immediately respond. This can create confusion. A person may start thinking differently, trying to see themselves in a new way, but nothing outside seems to confirm it yet. During this time, it is easy to fall back into old assumptions because they feel more familiar and supported by past evidence. But inner assumption does not require immediate validation. In fact, its power lies in persistence without proof. When a new assumption is held steadily, even in the absence of external confirmation, it begins to influence perception. You start noticing different details, interpreting situations differently, and reacting in ways that align with the new internal state. This shift is not dramatic at first. It is subtle. You may not even notice it immediately. But slowly, your responses change. The same situation that once triggered doubt may no longer affect you in the same way. The same opportunity that once felt out of reach may start to feel more natural to consider. This is how internal change begins to shape external experience. Inner assumption also affects how you treat yourself in private moments. The way you think when no one is watching is often more powerful than anything you say publicly. If your inner assumption is aligned with limitation, you may unknowingly reinforce that through self-talk, hesitation, and emotional reactions. But if your assumption shifts toward possibility, even slightly, your private thoughts begin to reflect that shift. One of the most important aspects of inner assumption is consistency. A single positive thought does not change much, but a repeated assumption held over time begins to form a mental baseline. Once something becomes a baseline, your mind automatically operates from it without constant effort. You no longer have to remind yourself who you are because it becomes the default way you interpret everything. This is why change often feels slow at first. It is not because nothing is happening, but because internal restructuring takes time to stabilize. The external world always lags behind the inner shift. That delay is where most people give up, thinking nothing is working. But in reality, that is the phase where transformation is quietly forming. Inner assumption is not about forcing belief, it is about gently occupying a new internal position long enough for it to feel natural. Once it feels natural, your thoughts begin to organize around it, your emotions align with it, and your actions start reflecting it without effort. At that point, what once felt like imagination begins to feel like lived experience gradually unfolding. Wealth begins in consciousness, not in the bank account, not in the job title, and not in the external circumstances that most people rely on to define success. Consciousness is the inner space where your thoughts, beliefs, and assumptions exist before they ever become action. It is the starting point of everything you experience. Most people try to change their financial situation by focusing only on external effort, but they rarely pay attention to the inner state that is actually directing that effort. When we say wealth begins in consciousness, it means your relationship with money is first formed inside your mind, long before money shows up in your hands. If your consciousness is filled with tension around money, if there is fear, doubt, or a constant sense of lack, then even when opportunities appear, they are filtered through that state. You may not even realize it, but your decisions will reflect that inner condition. You might hesitate, delay action, or choose paths that feel safer but do not expand you. On the other hand, when consciousness is expanded, even without external changes, the way you perceive money begins to shift. You start to think differently about possibility. You stop seeing every situation as limited. Instead of reacting from fear, you begin to observe from a calmer internal place. This does not mean problems disappear, but your interpretation of those problems changes, and that shift in interpretation is where new outcomes begin. Many people assume wealth is something they need to chase in the physical world. They believe if they work harder, wait longer, or find the right opportunity, it will eventually arrive. But that approach often ignores the inner state they are carrying while doing all of that. If consciousness remains rooted in lack, then even success feels unstable when it arrives. People often reach financial milestones but still feel insecure because their internal state did not evolve with the external change. Consciousness shapes expectation, and expectation shapes action. If you expect struggle, you prepare for struggle even when things are improving. If you expect limitation, you unconsciously narrow your decisions to fit that belief. This is why two people with similar opportunities can end up with completely different financial outcomes. It is not only about what they do, but about the internal reality from which they are doing it. Wealth is not only about accumulation, it is also about comfort with receiving. Some people resist receiving without realizing it. They may feel uncomfortable when things get easy, or when opportunities come without struggle. That discomfort is not external, it is rooted in consciousness. If someone has always associated effort with struggle, then ease feels unfamiliar, even suspicious. So they unconsciously return to what feels normal, even if it is not what they want. Changing financial reality without changing consciousness is difficult because the outer world simply reflects what is already stabilized inside. If consciousness is unstable around money, then financial experiences will also feel unstable. Even moments of gain may be followed by fear of loss. But when consciousness becomes steady, the external experience begins to reflect that stability over time. This is why some people seem to grow financially in a more consistent way. Even if they do not always have perfect conditions, their internal state is not constantly shifting between extremes of hope and fear. Instead, there is a baseline sense of stability in how they relate to money and opportunity. That stability creates clearer decisions, and clearer decisions naturally produce better outcomes over time. Wealth in consciousness also means how you see yourself in relation to value. If you see yourself as someone who is always behind, always catching up, or always trying to reach a certain level, then that self-image influences how you operate. You may accept less than you deserve or hesitate to position yourself in situations where expansion is possible, not because you are incapable, but because your inner identity has not expanded yet. When consciousness shifts even slightly, your interpretation of value begins to change. You start to recognize your time, your skills, and your decisions differently. You stop underestimating what you bring to situations. This does not mean arrogance, it means clarity. And clarity is important because financial decisions made from confusion often lead to repetition of the same cycle. Another important aspect is that consciousness does not respond instantly to logic. You can know something intellectually and still not feel it internally. That gap is where most people struggle. They understand ideas about wealth, they read about it, they hear it, but their internal state remains unchanged. Without internal alignment, knowledge stays theoretical. As consciousness begins to shift, your reactions to money-related situations also begin to change. You may notice less emotional intensity around financial uncertainty. You may find yourself thinking more clearly in situations that previously created stress. These changes are subtle, but they are important because they indicate that your internal reference point is moving. Over time, consciousness begins to set the tone for your financial life. It becomes the foundation from which decisions are made, opportunities are recognized, and risks are evaluated. When that foundation is rooted in lack, everything built on it carries instability. But when it is rooted in expansion, even gradual change starts to feel more natural and sustainable. Wealth is not just a result, it is a reflection. It reflects how you think when there is no immediate pressure, how you feel when nothing is confirming success yet, and how you see yourself in moments of uncertainty. And as those internal patterns shift, the reflection in your external life begins to shift with them in a steady, natural way. Feeling is often the missing piece that most people overlook when they try to change their life. They focus on thoughts, on logic, on repetition of ideas, but they rarely pay attention to the actual emotional state behind those thoughts. Yet feeling is the part of you that gives life to everything you believe. Without feeling, a thought remains empty. It may sound correct, it may even look powerful on paper, but internally it does not register as real. When we talk about feeling as the ignition point, it means the moment something is not just understood in the mind, but experienced within the body and awareness at the same time. There is a difference between thinking I am successful and actually feeling the inner sense of being settled, certain, and aligned with that idea. The mind alone can repeat anything, but the feeling is what signals acceptance at a deeper level. Most people try to change their reality by changing their words first. They repeat affirmations or new statements, but internally they may still feel the opposite. That internal contradiction weakens the impact. The mind is not guided only by language, it is guided by emotional truth. If the feeling does not match the statement, the subconscious does not fully accept it. It stays as a surface-level idea instead of becoming an inner belief. Feeling is what turns imagination into something the mind treats as real. When you feel something deeply, even without external proof, your system begins to respond as if it matters. This is why emotions are so closely linked to memory and belief. You remember what you felt more strongly than what you simply thought. The emotional layer gives weight to experience. When someone is trying to shift their identity or their life direction, the feeling behind their intention becomes more important than the words they use. If the feeling is rooted in doubt, even positive thinking will not fully land. But if there is even a small moment of genuine feeling that aligns with the new direction, it creates an internal reference point that the mind can return to. This is why moments of clarity often feel powerful. It is not because everything has changed externally, but because internally there is alignment between thought and feeling. In that moment, resistance is reduced. There is less internal conflict, and the idea feels natural instead of forced. That natural feeling is what allows change to begin. Feeling also plays a key role in how consistently someone acts. When actions are driven only by logic, they often feel heavy or inconsistent. But when there is emotional alignment, even small actions feel easier to take. The body is no longer resisting the direction. There is a sense of flow that supports movement instead of blocking it. Many people underestimate how much their current feelings are shaping their current reality. If someone consistently feels stuck, anxious, or uncertain, those feelings influence how they interpret situations. Even neutral events can feel like setbacks when the emotional baseline is low. On the other hand, when someone feels more grounded and certain internally, the same situations are processed differently. Feeling is also what connects identity to experience. You do not just think who you are, you feel who you are. That feeling becomes familiar. and familiarity becomes identity. If someone constantly feels like they are behind in life, that emotional state becomes part of their self-image. It does not matter how many positive thoughts they repeat if the underlying feeling remains unchanged. Changing feeling is not about forcing emotions, it is about allowing a different internal state to become familiar over time. At first, new feelings may feel unfamiliar or even uncomfortable because they are not aligned with long-standing patterns. But with repetition and attention, the mind begins to accept them as possible, then normal, then natural. Feeling also determines how real something seems internally. You can imagine two different futures, but the one that carries stronger feeling will feel more believable. This is why people often stay attached to certain expectations, even negative ones, because they are emotionally familiar. The emotional charge gives those thoughts persistence. When feeling and thought align, something important happens. The idea stops being just a concept and starts becoming an internal experience. In that state, the mind no longer debates whether it is possible in the same way. It begins to treat it as part of its direction. This is where inner shift begins to take form. Feeling is also what influences persistence. When there is emotional connection to a direction, it becomes easier to stay consistent even when external results are not immediate. Without feeling, motivation tends to fade quickly because it is only supported by logic. But when feeling is present, there is a deeper reason to continue beyond what is visible. The challenge most people face is that they try to change everything from the outside first, without addressing the internal emotional state that is guiding them. They want new results, but the feeling behind their actions remains the same. Without changing that layer, the pattern tends to repeat. Feeling is not something separate from creation, it is part of it. It is the internal signal that tells your system what is important, what is real, and what direction you are moving in. When that signal changes, everything connected to it begins to adjust slowly over time. This is why even small shifts in feeling can be significant. A slight sense of calm instead of stress, a moment of certainty instead of doubt, or a brief feeling of alignment can act as a starting point. These moments may seem small, but they are the beginning of a different internal pattern forming. Over time, as feeling becomes more consistent with a new direction, thoughts begin to organize around it, actions begin to reflect it more naturally, and perception begins to change. What once felt distant starts to feel closer, not because the external world changed first, but because the internal experience of it changed first. Present reality feels solid, immediate, and unquestionable to most people. What you can see, touch, and measure right now appears to be the final truth about your life. But in deeper terms, what you are experiencing in this moment is not a fixed endpoint. It is the visible outcome of a long chain of earlier thoughts, decisions, assumptions, and emotional states that have already passed through you over time. It is not created instantly, it is revealed with delay. When we say present reality is a delayed reflection, it means there is always a time gap between what you consistently think and feel internally and what eventually shows up externally. Life does not respond instantly to every thought you have. Instead, it responds to sustained inner patterns. By the time something appears in your physical reality, it has already been shaped by who you were, being mentally and emotionally in previous moments, days, or even longer periods. This delay is the reason many people misunderstand their own power. They look at their current situation and assume it is a direct, real-time measurement of who they are right now, but that is not accurate. What they are seeing is more like a snapshot of a past internal state that has already moved on. Meanwhile, their current thoughts are already beginning to shape what will appear next, even if they cannot see it yet. This creates an important distinction. There is the present moment of consciousness where you are thinking and feeling now, and there is the physical reflection of earlier patterns that are just now becoming visible. These two are not perfectly aligned in time. One is creating, the other is catching up. Most people only pay attention to the reflection and forget about the source. Because of this delay, emotional reactions to current circumstances can sometimes reinforce older patterns. If someone sees a situation they do not like and reacts with fear, doubt, or frustration, they are often re-entering the same emotional state that contributed to that situation in the first place. Without realizing it, they strengthen the very cycle they are trying to change. Understanding this delay changes how you relate to your current life. Instead of treating everything you see as final, you begin to recognize it as a transitional stage. It becomes easier to observe situations without immediately assigning them permanent meaning. You start to see that this moment is not the conclusion, but part of a continuing process. This does not mean ignoring reality or pretending things are different on the surface. It means recognizing that surface conditions are not static truth. They are moving outcomes of inner activity. Once that understanding becomes clearer, your emotional relationship with circumstances begins to shift. You are less likely to feel trapped by what is currently visible. Present reality feels convincing because it engages your senses directly. You can see results, numbers, situations, and interactions unfolding in real time. But what your senses show you is always slightly behind the internal cause. There is always a delay between inner formation and outer expression. This is why change often feels invisible at first, even when it is already happening. During this delay period, it is common for doubt to arise. People look around and think nothing is changing because they cannot yet see external confirmation. But the absence of visible change does not mean absence of internal movement. It simply means the process is still unfolding below the surface of perception. If you understand that your current reality is delayed, you also begin to understand that your current thoughts are already ahead of it. What you are thinking and accepting now is not primarily about your present situation. It is about what will be reflected later. This creates a shift in responsibility. Instead of reacting only to what is, you begin to become aware of what you are currently reinforcing. This perspective reduces the power of immediate appearance. A difficult situation no longer feels like a permanent statement about your identity. It becomes information about a previous internal state. That separation creates space between you and what you are experiencing. In that space, you gain the ability to respond differently rather than react automatically. Many people stay stuck because they treat present reality as the source of truth instead of the result of previous inner activity. They analyze what is happening now as if it defines their entire future. But if reality is delayed, then present conditions are not predicting the future directly. They are simply completing an earlier cycle. Once this is understood, attention naturally begins to shift inward. Instead of constantly asking why things are not changing outside, the focus moves toward what is being held consistently inside. This does not mean ignoring external action, but it changes the starting point of action from reaction to intention. Over time, as internal patterns shift and remain stable, the delayed reflection begins to change as well. At first, these changes are subtle. Small differences in response, small shifts in opportunity, slight changes in how situations unfold. But these small changes are indicators that the internal source has already started moving in a different direction. Eventually, what once felt like fixed reality begins to feel more flexible. Not because the external world became unstable, but because you stop treating it as final. You begin to see it as responsive. And when something is understood as responsive rather than fixed, your entire relationship with it changes in a quiet but meaningful way. The idea of "I am" being the most powerful declaration is not about language alone. It is about identity being formed in the present moment of awareness. I am is not just a phrase you say, it is the point where you define yourself internally without needing any explanation. Whatever follows those two words becomes the direction your mind accepts as true about you, whether you realize it or not. When someone says, "I am struggling," the mind does not treat it as a casual sentence. It accepts it as a current identity statement. Even if it is said lightly, it still creates a subtle internal agreement. The same applies when someone says, "I am confident," or "I am not ready." These are not just descriptions, they are instructions the mind begins to organize itself around. What makes "I am" so powerful is that it happens in the present moment. It is not about the past or the future. It is a direct statement of being. And because the mind always operates from what it believes is true now, whatever you attach to "I am" becomes the starting point of your perception and behavior. You are not speaking about yourself from a distance, you are defining yourself from within. Most people are not aware of how often they use "I am" in ways that reinforce old patterns. It becomes automatic. I am tired, I am unlucky, I am always late, I am not good at this. These statements may feel harmless in conversation, but internally they become repeated instructions that shape how you see yourself. Over time, they form a familiar identity that feels normal, even if it is limiting. The mind does not argue with what is repeatedly accepted as identity. It simply organizes thoughts, decisions, and attention to match it. If someone consistently identifies as not capable, their mind will find reasons to avoid challenges, not because they lack ability, but because their internal identity is not aligned with it. Behavior always follows identity, not the other way around. When someone begins to consciously use I am differently, they are not just changing words, they are changing direction at the level of self-definition. For example, saying, I am becoming more stable feels different from I am stable. One keeps identity in transition, the other places it in the present. The mind responds more strongly to present identity than to future possibility. This is why present tense identity is so important. The mind does not live in the future. It always responds to what feels true now. If something feels like a future goal, it stays slightly distant in experience. But if it is accepted as present identity, even internally, the mind begins to adjust behavior to match it. The power of I am is also tied to emotional agreement. It is not enough to say the words. The feeling behind them determines how deeply they are accepted. If someone says I am successful while feeling doubt, the message is conflicted. The surface is saying one thing, but the deeper emotional layer is not aligned. In that case, the mind does not fully commit to the statement. But when I am is spoken or held with even a moment of genuine feeling, something different happens. The mind experiences alignment between thought and emotion. In that alignment, resistance reduces and acceptance becomes easier. That is when a statement starts to move from concept into identity. Another important aspect is repetition over time. The mind does not change from a single statement, it changes through consistency. If I am statements are repeatedly tied to a certain identity, the mind gradually starts to treat that identity as familiar. And what becomes familiar begins to feel natural. Once something feels natural, it no longer requires effort to maintain. This is why identity change often feels subtle at first. You do not suddenly become a different person in behavior. Instead, your internal language begins to shift slowly. The way you describe yourself in your own mind starts to change, and that shift in inner language eventually leads to changes in perception and decision-making. I am also influences how you interpret experiences. If your identity is rooted in limitation, even neutral events can be interpreted negatively. But if your identity is rooted in expansion, the same events are interpreted differently. The situation itself does not change, but the meaning you assign to it does, and meaning is what guides response. This is why identity is often more powerful than motivation. Motivation comes and goes based on emotion and circumstance. Identity is more stable because it sits underneath motivation. If someone identifies as disciplined, they do not need constant motivation to act in a disciplined way. Their behavior aligns more naturally with how they see themselves. Changing I am is not about forcing positivity. It is about becoming aware of what you are already accepting unconsciously and gently redirecting it. Many people already use I am in limiting ways without noticing. The shift begins when that pattern becomes visible and new possibilities are introduced gradually. At first, new I am statements may not feel fully true. That is expected because identity does not change instantly. There is always a transition phase where the old identity still feels more real. During this phase, consistency matters more than intensity. The mind begins to adjust through repetition combined with attention. Over time, as new I am patterns are held steadily, they begin to influence thoughts automatically. You start noticing that your internal dialogue shifts without effort. You respond differently in situations that previously triggered old reactions. The change feels natural rather than forced. I am is powerful because it is always active. Even when you are not consciously thinking about it, your mind is still operating from a version of identity you have accepted. The shift happens when you begin to consciously choose what follows those words and stay consistent long enough for the mind to reorganize itself around it. Doubt is often misunderstood as something meaningful or intelligent, but in reality it is mostly a habit of the mind that has been repeated for a long time. It feels like reasoning, it feels like protection, but most of the time it is simply a learned response that shows up whenever something unfamiliar or uncertain appears in your experience. It is not always based on truth, it is based on conditioning. When you look closely at doubt, you can see that it rarely arrives with clear evidence. It usually appears in the form of questions, hesitation, or imagined outcomes that have not happened yet. the mind starts creating scenarios that feel realistic even though they are only projections. Over time, this pattern becomes automatic, so instead of responding to what is actually happening, the mind responds to what it fears might happen. Most people assume doubt is a sign that they need to think more carefully, but in many cases it is just repetition of old thinking patterns. If someone has repeatedly experienced uncertainty in life, their mind learns to default to doubt whenever something new is introduced. It becomes a familiar mental pathway, and because it feels familiar, it feels safe, even when it is limiting. Doubt is powerful not because it is accurate, but because it interrupts action. It slows down decisions. It creates hesitation where there could have been movement. And in that pause, the mind often returns to old patterns instead of exploring new possibilities. This is how doubt quietly maintains continuity with past experiences. What makes doubt feel convincing is that it often disguises itself as careful thinking. It asks questions like, "What if this doesn't work?" Or, "Are you sure about this?" On the surface, these questions seem responsible, but if you observe closely, they rarely lead to clarity. Instead, they lead to more thinking, more analysis, and less movement. The energy shifts from doing to over-evaluating. This is why doubt is not just a thought, it is a state. When someone is in doubt, their entire internal experience changes. Their attention becomes fragmented, their focus weakens, their sense of direction becomes unclear. Even simple decisions can feel heavier than they actually are. The situation itself may not be difficult, but the internal state makes it feel that way. Doubt also relies heavily on comparison with the past. It looks at what has happened before and uses it as evidence for what might happen again. If something failed in the past, doubt uses that memory to question present attempts. But it does not always consider that the current situation is not identical to the past. It simplifies experience into patterns, even when new variables are present. One of the strongest ways doubt sustains itself is through repetition. The more a person entertains doubtful thoughts, the more natural they become. Over time, the mind begins to generate doubt automatically in similar situations. This is why some people feel doubt very quickly whenever they try something new. It is not the situation itself triggering it, but the trained response of the mind. Even though doubt feels strong, it does not actually create anything new. It mostly recycles old information. It replays past experiences, past fears, and past interpretations. It does not operate from the present moment fully. Instead, it pulls from memory and projects it forward. This is why it often feels repetitive and predictable when observed carefully. When someone begins to shift their awareness, they start to notice that doubt is not always aligned with reality. It may suggest failure even when there is no evidence of failure happening. It may suggest delay even when progress is already in motion. This realization weakens its influence over time because it is no longer seen as truth, but as a pattern. Doubt becomes weaker when it is not immediately obeyed. Most people treat doubtful thoughts as instructions, so they pause, delay, or stop. But when doubt is observed without automatic reaction, its influence begins to reduce. It loses its authority because it is no longer controlling behavior directly. It is just a mental activity, not a command. There is also a difference between awareness and identification. You can be aware of doubt without becoming it. The moment someone identifies with doubt, it becomes their reality in that moment, but if they can observe it as something passing through the mind, it starts to lose its grip. It becomes one voice among many, not the final decision maker. Doubt often appears stronger when someone is close to change or growth. This is because the mind prefers familiar patterns. When something new is about to happen, the mind tries to pull attention back to what it already knows. It creates resistance in the form of questions and hesitation. But that resistance is not proof of danger, it is proof of unfamiliarity. The interesting part is that doubt does not disappear completely for most people. Instead, its influence changes. It no longer dominates decisions as strongly. It becomes quieter in the background instead of the main driver. This shift happens gradually as new patterns of thinking become more stable. When a person begins to act despite doubt, something important changes internally. Experience starts to override imagination. The mind realizes that not every doubtful thought leads to reality. This weakens the automatic trust placed in doubt. Over time, confidence is not the absence of doubt, but the ability to move without being controlled by it. Doubt is also closely connected to identity. If someone sees themselves as uncertain, their mind produces more doubtful thoughts to match that identity. But if their internal identity begins to shift toward clarity and direction, doubt loses some of its consistency. It does not disappear instantly, but it no longer feels like the default state. Understanding doubt in this way removes some of its power. Instead of treating it as a signal that something is wrong, it becomes something that can be recognized and observed without reaction. And when reaction decreases, clarity naturally increases, allowing decisions to feel lighter and more aligned over time. Certainty is not something loud or dramatic. It does not need to prove itself through constant explanation or external validation. It is a quiet internal state where something simply feels settled within you. When certainty is present, the mind is no longer split between multiple directions. There is a sense of alignment where thought, feeling, and decision are no longer arguing with each other. Most people confuse certainty with confidence, but they are not exactly the same. Confidence can still have noise in it. It can still seek approval or rely on external reinforcement. Certainty is different because it does not depend on anything outside. It is internally anchored. Even if nothing in the environment supports it yet, it still holds its position without collapsing under doubt. When certainty is present, decision-making becomes naturally simpler. You do not spend the same amount of time analyzing every possibility. The mind is not constantly reopening the same question again and again. There is a sense of closure within the thought itself. That closure is what allows movement without inner resistance. What makes certainty powerful is that it reduces internal conflict. Most people do not struggle because of external complexity alone, but because of inner contradiction. One part of the mind wants to move forward, while another part questions every step. This creates hesitation, delay, and emotional friction. Certainty removes that friction by aligning internal direction. Certainty is not built from overthinking. In fact, overthinking usually weakens it. It grows when there is a moment of clear internal agreement, even if that moment is small. It can start as a simple feeling that something is right, even without complete evidence. That feeling, when held steadily, begins to shape the way the mind organizes information. One important thing about certainty is that it feels calm. It does not feel rushed or pressured. When someone is truly certain, they are not trying to convince themselves repeatedly. They are not seeking constant reassurance. There is a quiet understanding that does not need to be defended. This calmness is what makes it stable. Many people operate from a state where certainty is absent, so they rely heavily on external feedback. They look for signs, opinions, or results before they feel sure about anything. This creates dependency on conditions that are always changing. When certainty is internal, the mind no longer depends so heavily on external signals to feel grounded. Certainty also influences how you interpret uncertainty. Life will always contain unknowns, but when your internal state is certain, unknown situations do not automatically create fear. Instead, they are seen as neutral spaces where things are still forming. The absence of clarity does not feel like danger. It feels like unfolding. When certainty is missing, even small challenges can feel overwhelming. The mind starts to question every step, every decision, and every outcome. But when certainty is present, challenges are processed differently. They are seen as part of movement rather than evidence of failure. This shift in interpretation changes the emotional weight of experiences. Certainty is closely connected to consistency. When someone is internally certain about something, their behavior becomes more stable. They do not constantly switch direction based on temporary feelings. This does not mean they never adjust, but their adjustments come from clarity, not confusion. There is a steady internal reference point guiding them. What strengthens certainty is experience aligned with inner agreement. When you act from a place of internal agreement and observe that things begin to respond in some way, even gradually, the mind starts to reinforce that state. It learns that this internal position is reliable. Over time, that reinforcement builds stability. Certainty also reduces emotional fluctuation. When someone is not certain, their emotions tend to shift quickly based on external changes. A small setback can feel large. A small success can feel temporary. But with certainty, emotional responses become more balanced. Situations are still felt, but they do not destabilize the inner state as easily. Another important aspect of certainty is that it simplifies perception. Instead of seeing many conflicting possibilities, the mind begins to focus on what feels aligned. This does not mean ignoring reality, but rather filtering it through a more stable internal lens. Clarity becomes more natural because the mind is not scattered. Certainty is often built through repetition of aligned states rather than constant effort. When you repeatedly return to a stable internal feeling, even after doubt appears, the mind begins to recognize that state as more familiar. Familiarity gradually turns into normalcy, and normalcy turns into identity. At first, certainty may feel like something you are practicing. It may not feel fully natural, but with time, it stops feeling like effort and starts feeling like your default way of being. That transition is subtle, but it changes everything about how decisions are made and how experiences are interpreted. One of the strongest signs of developing certainty is reduced need for external confirmation. You begin to trust your internal sense more than constant external validation. This does not mean ignoring feedback, but it means not depending on it to feel grounded. The inner state becomes the primary reference point. Certainty also changes the relationship with time. Instead of feeling like everything must happen quickly or immediately, there is a sense of steady unfolding. You are not constantly measuring progress against urgency. There is patience, but not passive waiting. It is more like steady movement without internal pressure. When certainty becomes stable, even silence or delay does not feel threatening. The mind does not immediately interpret absence of results as failure. Instead, it understands that processes have their own timing. This removes unnecessary emotional stress from the experience of waiting or developing. Ultimately, certainty is not about controlling outcomes. It is about stabilizing the internal state from which you experience and respond to life. When that state becomes consistent, everything you do carries less internal conflict and more clarity. Actions become cleaner, thoughts become simpler, and the overall experience of life feels less fragmented and more aligned. Imagination is often misunderstood as something casual or unreal, like daydreaming or escaping from the present moment. But in a deeper sense, imagination is where experience is first formed before it ever becomes visible in the physical world. It is the internal space where you preview possibilities, shape ideas, and quietly construct the direction your life moves toward, even when you are not consciously trying to do so. Most people use imagination without realizing its importance. They imagine outcomes throughout the day, sometimes positively and sometimes negatively. They imagine conversations that might happen, situations that could unfold, and results they fear or desire. These mental images are not random. They influence emotional responses and subtle decisions. Even when nothing is physically happening, imagination is still active, shaping perception in the background. What makes imagination powerful is that it does not distinguish between what is physically present and what is vividly experienced internally. When you imagine something with clarity and emotional involvement, your mind processes it in a way that feels real on a psychological level. This is why imagined experiences can create emotional reactions similar to real experiences. The mind responds to the experience itself, not just the external source. Imagination acts like a blueprint. Before any action is taken, there is usually some form of internal picture or feeling that guides it. You may not always notice it, but even simple decisions are influenced by imagined outcomes. Whether you choose to approach something or avoid it often depends on the internal scenario you are holding about what might happen next. When imagination is consistently used in a certain direction, it begins to shape expectation. And expectation is what prepares the mind for experience. If someone repeatedly imagines struggle or limitation, their mind starts to prepare for those outcomes emotionally and behaviorally. If someone imagines possibility and expansion, even subtly, their internal state begins to shift in that direction as well. This does not mean imagination alone changes external reality instantly. Instead, it changes how you relate to reality, which eventually influences how you act within it. Action is always guided by internal interpretation, so whatever you repeatedly imagine becomes part of the lens through which you interpret opportunities, risks, and decisions. Imagination is also closely linked to identity. The way you see yourself is supported by repeated internal images and thoughts. If you consistently imagine yourself as someone who is limited or always trying, that image becomes familiar, and what becomes familiar feels true. On the other hand, if you begin to imagine yourself as capable, stable, or aligned with a different level of experience, even in small ways, that begins to shift internal self-perception over time. One of the most overlooked aspects of imagination is that it is always active, even when you are not intentionally using it. The mind naturally creates scenarios in response to daily life. The difference is whether those scenarios are conscious or unconscious. When unconscious imagination dominates, it often reinforces old patterns. When it becomes more conscious, it can be guided in a different direction. Imagination also plays a role in emotional states. When you imagine negative outcomes repeatedly, your body can respond as if those outcomes are already happening. This creates unnecessary emotional weight in the present moment. Similarly, when you imagine stable or positive outcomes, your emotional state can begin to align with those experiences even before they appear externally. This is why imagination is not separate from experience. It is part of how experience is formed internally first. The external world often reflects patterns that have already been rehearsed mentally. Repetition of thought and imagination creates familiarity, and familiarity influences behavior without requiring conscious effort. When someone begins to intentionally shift their imagination, they are not denying reality. They are adjusting the internal foundation from which reality is interpreted. This shift may feel subtle at first because external conditions do not change immediately. But internally, perception begins to reorganize. What once felt unlikely may start to feel possible. What once felt distant may begin to feel closer. Imagination also helps the mind prepare for new behavior. When you imagine yourself responding differently in situations, you are essentially rehearsing new internal responses. Over time, this rehearsal reduces resistance when similar real situations appear. The mind has already experienced a version of it internally, so it feels less unfamiliar externally. Most people underestimate imagination because they associate it only with creativity or entertainment. But it is also a daily mental process that influences direction, motivation, and interpretation. Even worry is a form of imagination, where the mind repeatedly constructs unwanted outcomes and reacts to them emotionally before they happen. Understanding imagination in this way gives more awareness of how internal experience is being shaped. It shows that not all mental activity is passive. Some of it is actively influencing emotional states and decision patterns. The more conscious you become of this process, the more you can gently redirect it instead of being fully carried by it. Imagination becomes more powerful when combined with feeling. A simple image in the mind may not have much impact, but when it is felt internally with some emotional involvement, it becomes more influential. This combination creates a stronger internal impression, which the mind tends to remember and return to more often. Over time, repeated imagination in a consistent direction begins to feel natural. The mind stops resisting it as much because it becomes familiar through repetition. Once familiarity is established, it starts influencing thoughts and expectations more smoothly. This is how internal patterns slowly shift without force. Imagination is not about escaping reality. It is about recognizing that internal experience is always active in shaping how reality is perceived and responded to. When guided consciously, it becomes a tool for creating internal alignment rather than unconscious repetition. And that internal alignment is what gradually influences external outcomes through consistent behavior and perception. Repetition without feeling is one of the most common mistakes people make when they try to change their mindset or life direction. On the surface, it looks like effort. It looks like discipline, like persistence, like doing the right thing over and over again. But internally, if there is no emotional alignment behind it, repetition becomes empty. It becomes mechanical, and the mind does not fully accept it as real. When someone repeats a statement or idea without feeling, they are only engaging the surface level of thought. The words may be correct, the structure may be clear, but the deeper layer of the mind remains unchanged. The subconscious does not respond strongly to repetition alone. It responds to what feels true internally. So if repetition is not supported by feeling, it often does not create lasting change. This is why people can repeat affirmations for a long time and still feel the same inside. They may say positive things repeatedly, but if their inner state does not shift, the repetition does not reach the deeper level where identity is formed. It stays at the level of mental noise rather than becoming internal acceptance. Feeling is what gives repetition weight. Without feeling, repetition is like saying words into empty space. With feeling, even a single statement can have more impact than hundreds of repeated phrases without emotional involvement. The difference is not in quantity but in depth of internal experience. When repetition is done without feeling, the mind can even start to resist it over time. It may feel forced or disconnected from reality. This resistance happens because there is a gap between what is being said and what is being internally experienced. The mind notices this gap, even if consciously you are trying to ignore it. On the other hand, when repetition is combined with even a small amount of genuine feeling, something different happens. The mind starts to associate the repeated idea with emotional reality. It begins to treat it as more familiar, and familiarity is what the mind eventually accepts as normal. That is how internal beliefs begin to shift. Feeling does not always have to be intense. It does not need to be dramatic or overwhelming. Even a quiet sense of alignment or slight emotional agreement can be enough to give repetition meaning. The key is not intensity, but authenticity. The mind responds more to what feels real than what feels forced. Most people assume that repetition alone creates change, but repetition only strengthens what is already emotionally supported. If the feeling behind repetition is doubt, then repetition strengthens doubt. If the feeling is uncertainty, then repetition reinforces uncertainty. This is why results often do not change even after long periods of trying. Repetition without feeling can also create frustration. A person may feel like they are doing everything right, saying the right things, thinking the right thoughts, but still not seeing results. This frustration comes from expecting external change without internal alignment. The repetition becomes an activity rather than a transformation. When feeling is added, repetition becomes a process of internal reinforcement rather than external effort. Each repetition is no longer just words being said, but an experience being felt and reinforced internally. This changes the quality of the repetition itself. It becomes less about trying and more about embodying. Feeling is also what connects repetition to identity. Identity is not formed by what you say once or twice. It is formed by what you consistently feel and accept about yourself over time. Repetition supports this process only when it is emotionally consistent. Otherwise, it remains on the surface and does not integrate deeply. Another important aspect is that the mind pays more attention to emotional signals than verbal ones. If there is conflict between what is said and what is felt, the feeling usually dominates. This is why people often act according to how they feel, even if they have repeated different thoughts mentally. Feeling overrides repetition when they are not aligned. Repetition becomes powerful when it is used as a way to return to a chosen feeling rather than just repeating words. In that case, the words are not the goal. They are a tool to stabilize an internal state. The focus shifts from saying something many times to gently re-entering a feeling state again and again. Without feeling, repetition can feel like pushing against resistance. With feeling, repetition becomes smoother because there is less internal contradiction. The mind is no longer split between belief and experience. Instead, there is gradual alignment between thought and emotion. Over time, repetition combined with feeling creates familiarity, and familiarity is what the mind naturally accepts as true. Once something becomes familiar, it no longer feels like effort to maintain. It becomes part of the internal background of thinking and perception. This is why change is not only about repeating new ideas, but about allowing those ideas to be felt in a way that feels honest, even if it is small at first. The feeling does not need to be perfect. It just needs to be real enough for the mind to recognize it as something worth integrating. When repetition and feeling are disconnected, the process becomes slow and inconsistent. But when they begin to align, even gradually, internal change starts to feel more natural. Thoughts begin to organize differently, emotional responses soften, and behavior begins to shift without as much force. In the end, repetition is only as effective as the feeling that supports it. Without feeling, it remains surface level. With feeling, it becomes a quiet form of internal training that gradually reshapes how something is understood, experienced, and ultimately lived. Inner state before external proof means that what you are being internally always comes first, and the outer world simply follows later as a delayed reflection of that state. Most people naturally believe the opposite. They wait for something to change outside so they can finally feel different inside. But in reality, the sequence always begins within consciousness first, even if it takes time for the results to become visible. Your inner state is the combination of your thoughts, feelings, assumptions, and self-image at any given moment. It is not just what you think once in a while, but the general tone you are carrying inside. That tone becomes the starting point for how you interpret everything. If your inner state is heavy with doubt, uncertainty, or lack, then even neutral events will feel like confirmation of those feelings. What makes this idea important is understanding that external proof always arrives later. There is a natural delay between inner change and outer manifestation. This delay creates confusion for many people because they expect immediate reflection. When they do not see instant results, they assume nothing is happening. But in reality, the inner state is already in motion, even if it has not yet become visible. For example, if someone begins to shift internally toward confidence or stability, there is often no immediate change in their surroundings. The same environment, the same challenges, and the same conditions may still appear unchanged. But internally, the way they interpret those situations starts to shift. That is the first stage of change, even though it is not yet visible externally. Most people make the mistake of relying on external proof before they allow themselves to fully commit to a new inner state. They think they need results first before they can feel differently. This creates a cycle where internal change is always delayed because they are waiting for confirmation that never comes instantly. As a result, the same patterns keep repeating. When someone understands that inner state comes first, they begin to separate themselves from immediate appearances. Instead of reacting to what is currently visible, they start paying attention to what they are consistently being internally. This creates a shift in focus from outcome to state, and that shift is where change begins to stabilize. Inner state is not something abstract. It shows up in small, practical ways. It affects how you speak, how you decide, how you react to uncertainty, and how you interpret delays or challenges. Even if nothing external has changed, your internal responses already begin to reveal whether your state has shifted or not. What is often overlooked is that external reality is not instant feedback. It is delayed feedback. By the time something appears in your physical experience, it has already gone through a process of thought, repetition, emotional reinforcement, and decision-making that happened earlier. So what you see today is not new creation, it is completion of something older. This understanding changes how you relate to current circumstances. Instead of treating them as fixed truth, you begin to see them as outcomes of a previous inner pattern. That separation allows you to stop over-identifying with what is currently happening. You start to recognize that your present state is more important than your present situation. Inner state before external proof also explains why change can feel slow at first. When someone shifts internally, there is often a phase where nothing external seems different. This gap can create doubt. But that gap is not emptiness, it is transition. The external world is still catching up to the internal shift that has already begun. During this transition period, consistency becomes important. If a person keeps returning to the old inner state every time they see no external change, then nothing new has time to form. But if they remain steady internally despite external delay, the new pattern begins to strengthen and stabilize. The mind often struggles with this delay because it prefers immediate validation. It wants to see proof quickly so it can feel safe in the new direction. But inner development does not work on instant feedback. It works on accumulation over time. Each moment of sustained inner state adds to the foundation of what will eventually appear externally. Another key point is that inner state influences perception. Even before external reality changes, your interpretation of it begins to shift. Situations that once felt discouraging may start to feel neutral. Opportunities that were previously ignored may start to stand out. This is the early sign that internal change is already active. People often underestimate this phase because they are still focused on visible results. But perception itself is part of reality formation. If your perception changes, your decisions begin to change. And when decisions change consistently, external outcomes eventually follow. Inner state before external proof also explains why forcing external change without internal alignment often feels unstable. When actions are taken from a state that does not match the desired outcome, there is internal resistance. This resistance can lead to inconsistency, burnout, or repeated cycles of effort without lasting change. But when internal state is aligned first, actions feel more natural. There is less internal conflict. Decisions are clearer. Even uncertainty feels easier to handle because the inner foundation is steady. This stability gradually influences external behavior in a more consistent way. What makes this concept powerful is realizing that you are not waiting for life to change you. Instead, life is responding to what you are consistently being internally. That shift in understanding removes the sense of helplessness many people feel when they look only at external conditions. Once inner state is understood as primary, attention naturally shifts inward. Instead of constantly analyzing external problems, you begin to observe your internal condition more closely. This does not mean ignoring reality, but it means recognizing where real change actually starts. Over time, as inner state becomes more stable and consistent, external reflection begins to adjust. It does not happen all at once, but gradually, in ways that confirm the internal shift has been taking place all along. You do not chase wealth in the way most people are taught to believe. The idea of chasing already creates a sense of distance, like wealth is something outside of you that must be caught, earned, or caught up to. That mindset alone keeps it feeling far away. When someone is always chasing, their attention is focused on lack, on what is missing, and on the idea that they are not there yet. That inner position shapes how they move, decide, and respond to life. To embody wealth means something very different. It means shifting from the mindset of pursuit to the mindset of identity. Instead of asking how to get it, the focus slowly moves toward who you are being while you move through life. This is a quieter shift. It is not about forcing behavior or pretending. It is about allowing a different internal reference point to guide how you think and act in everyday situations. When someone is chasing wealth, their decisions often come from urgency. There is a sense of pressure, like time is running out or something needs to happen quickly. That urgency can lead to scattered thinking, inconsistent action, and emotional reactions to results. Even when progress is made, it does not feel stable, because the internal state is still rooted in pursuit rather than embodiment. Embodiment begins when wealth is no longer treated as a destination, but as a state of being. This does not mean you ignore practical reality or stop taking action. It means the source of your action changes. Instead of acting from lack, you begin to act from a different internal assumption about yourself. That assumption might not be fully visible in your external life yet, but it becomes the foundation of how you move. When you embody something, your behavior naturally aligns with it over time. You do not have to constantly remind yourself to act a certain way. It becomes more natural because it is rooted in identity rather than effort. Effort is still present, but it is not driven by desperation or urgency. It is driven by internal alignment. Most people are used to linking wealth with external signs. They believe wealth is something that will be proven by numbers, possessions, or visible results. Because of this, they stay in a loop of waiting for confirmation before they allow themselves to feel different internally. But this keeps them dependent on external validation, which is always delayed and inconsistent. Embodiment changes that relationship. It allows you to begin from within, even when external confirmation has not fully arrived. This does not mean ignoring reality or pretending conditions are different. It means not allowing current conditions to define your internal identity. There is a separation between what is happening and who you are being while it happens. When wealth is embodied, decisions begin to reflect a different internal standard. You start to notice that you no longer tolerate certain patterns of thinking or behavior that do not align with the identity you are holding. This is not forced discipline, but a natural shift in preference. What once felt acceptable may no longer feel aligned. This shift also affects how you respond to uncertainty. In a chasing mindset, uncertainty often creates anxiety or hesitation. In an embodied mindset, uncertainty is processed more calmly. It is not immediately interpreted as danger or failure. Instead, it is seen as part of movement and development. That change in interpretation reduces emotional resistance. Embodiment also changes your relationship with time. When you are chasing, time feels like pressure. There is always a sense that things are not happening fast enough. But when you embody the state, time feels more like unfolding. You are not constantly measuring progress against urgency. Instead, you are allowing consistent movement without emotional pressure. Another important shift is in attention. When chasing, attention is often fixed on what is not yet achieved. This keeps reinforcing the feeling of absence. When embodying, attention gradually shifts toward alignment. You begin to notice what supports your direction instead of constantly focusing on what is missing. This does not mean ignoring problems, but it changes the center of focus. Embodiment also reduces internal conflict. When your actions are not aligned with your identity, there is tension between what you are doing and what you believe about yourself. That tension creates resistance and inconsistency. But when identity and action begin to align even gradually, that resistance decreases. things feel more coherent internally. One of the most subtle but important aspects of embodiment is that it changes how you interpret your current reality. Instead of seeing it as proof of limitation, you start seeing it as something in transition. This removes the emotional weight of permanence. What you are experiencing now is no longer treated as a final definition of you. Over time, embodiment builds consistency. You stop switching between different mental states depending on external conditions. Your internal reference becomes more stable. This stability is what allows decisions to become clearer and behavior to become more consistent even when external circumstances fluctuate. At first, this approach can feel unfamiliar because most people are conditioned to rely on external proof before changing internally. But embodiment works in reverse. It begins internally and allows external reflection to follow. This delay between inner shift and outer confirmation is where patience and consistency matter most. As embodiment deepens, you begin to notice that you are no longer reacting as strongly to external conditions. Situations that once created emotional highs or lows feel more neutral. There is still awareness, but less internal instability. This neutrality is a sign that identity is becoming more anchored. Eventually, embodiment becomes less about trying to hold a state and more about it becoming your default way of being. You are no longer constantly reminding yourself of a concept. Instead, your thoughts, choices, and interpretations naturally reflect a more aligned internal position. In this way, wealth stops being something you pursue and starts becoming something you live from internally. The external world then begins to reflect that shift gradually, not because you chased harder, but because your internal state stopped operating from lack and started operating from alignment. The subconscious mind accepts what is felt as real more easily than what is simply thought or repeated. This is one of the most important but often misunderstood aspects of inner change. People usually believe that if they repeat something enough times or understand it logically, it will eventually become real for them. But the subconscious does not operate mainly through logic. It operates through emotional acceptance and felt experience. When something is felt deeply, even for a short moment, it leaves a stronger impression than repeated thoughts without feeling. This is because feeling is the language the subconscious responds to most naturally. It does not analyze in the way the conscious mind does. It absorbs patterns based on emotional intensity and repetition of experience. So what you consistently feel becomes more influential than what you occasionally think. This is why two people can think the same positive thought but experience completely different internal results. One person may feel disconnected while saying it, and the other may feel even a small sense of alignment. The difference is not in the words, but in the level of emotional agreement behind them. The subconscious responds more strongly to that emotional agreement than to the words themselves. Most people try to change their inner world by focusing heavily on thinking. They repeat ideas, they analyze situations, and they try to convince themselves through logic. But if their emotional state remains unchanged, the subconscious continues to follow the older pattern. This is why real change often feels slower than expected when it is only approached through thinking. The subconscious is also responsible for habits, automatic responses, and emotional reactions. These patterns are not formed overnight. They are built through repeated emotional experiences over time. When a certain feeling is experienced again and again in similar situations, the subconscious begins to treat it as a normal response. It becomes part of the internal programming. Because of this, changing subconscious patterns requires more than just new ideas. It requires new emotional experiences that begin to replace the old ones. Even small moments of different feeling can begin to shift the direction, because the subconscious is constantly recording what is experienced emotionally, not just what is understood intellectually. When something feels real internally, the subconscious does not question it in the same way the conscious mind does. It simply begins to organize behavior and perception around it. This is why emotional states can influence decisions without a person realizing it immediately. The subconscious is always working in the background to maintain consistency between what is felt and what is experienced. This also explains why fear, doubt, or lack can feel so persistent. If those emotions have been experienced repeatedly, the subconscious has accepted them as familiar states. Familiarity does not necessarily mean truth, but it does mean stability for the subconscious. It prefers what is known over what is unknown, even if the unknown is more beneficial. When someone tries to introduce a new idea into their mind, but it does not feel real yet, the subconscious does not fully accept it. It remains at the surface level of thought. It may sound good intellectually, but internally there is no emotional agreement yet. Without that agreement, the old patterns continue to dominate behavior and perception. This is why feeling is often more important than repetition alone. Feeling acts as a signal of acceptance. When something is felt, even briefly, the subconscious begins to treat it as part of experience rather than just information. That is the moment when internal shift begins to take place. Over time, repeated feeling of a new state can begin to replace older emotional patterns. This does not happen instantly. It happens gradually, through consistency. Each time a new emotional response is experienced and accepted, it weakens the dominance of the old pattern slightly. Eventually, the new feeling becomes more familiar. The subconscious does not respond well to conflict. If there is a strong contradiction between what is being thought and what is being felt, it tends to follow the stronger emotional signal. This is why forcing positive thoughts without emotional alignment often does not produce lasting change. The emotional layer always carries more weight. When feeling becomes more consistent with a new direction, perception begins to shift as well. The same situations may still exist, but they are interpreted differently. What once felt overwhelming may start to feel manageable. What once felt uncertain may start to feel neutral. This change in interpretation is a sign that subconscious patterns are beginning to adjust. Another important aspect is that the subconscious does not separate imagination from experience as clearly as the conscious mind does. When something is vividly imagined and felt, it can register similarly to real experience on an emotional level. This is why internal experiences can shape expectations and responses so strongly. Because of this, what you repeatedly feel internally becomes a reference point for future reactions. The subconscious uses these emotional references to guide behavior automatically. If the dominant feeling is aligned with limitation, it will continue producing responses that reflect that. If the dominant feeling begins to shift, responses also begin to shift over time. This process is subtle, which is why many people do not notice it happening immediately. They expect dramatic external changes, but the real shift begins internally at the level of feeling and acceptance. External results come later as a reflection of those internal adjustments. Understanding that the subconscious accepts what is felt as real helps explain why inner change requires emotional consistency rather than just intellectual effort. It is not about convincing yourself through words alone. It is about gradually allowing a different emotional state to become more familiar than the old one. As this familiarity grows, the subconscious begins to reorganize thoughts, reactions, and perceptions around the new feeling. And over time, what was once only imagined or briefly experienced internally begins to feel more natural and stable in everyday experience. When someone shifts from seeking to being, their attention starts to reorganize. Instead of constantly scanning for what is missing, they begin to notice what is already aligned or in motion. This does not ignore challenges, but it changes the emotional weight attached to them. Being also affects decision-making. When decisions are made from seeking, they are often influenced by pressure or comparison. There is a sense of needing to catch up or fix something. When decisions are made from being, they come from a quieter place of internal clarity. There is less hesitation because the identity behind the decision feels more stable. Another important aspect is that seeking often reinforces lack. The more a person focuses on what they do not have, the stronger the feeling of not having becomes. This does not mean awareness of goals is negative, but constant emotional attachment to lack can reinforce that experience internally. Being shifts that focus. Instead of reinforcing lack, attention is placed more on identity and internal state. The question becomes less about when something will happen and more about how one is internally aligning with the direction they are already moving toward. This shift also changes emotional experience. Seeking often creates emotional highs and lows depending on external feedback. Being creates a more steady emotional background because internal identity is not constantly fluctuating based on external outcomes. Over time, this stability allows for more consistent behavior. When the internal state is less reactive, actions become less interrupted by emotional swings. This supports continuity, which is important for long-term development in any area of life. It is also important to understand that shifting from seeking to being is not an instant change. It is a gradual reorientation of attention and identity. At first, a person may still fall back into seeking patterns, especially when external circumstances feel uncertain. But with awareness, they can begin returning to a more stable internal position. As this shift continues, the external world is no longer seen as something that defines worth. Instead, it becomes something that reflects ongoing internal states over time. This reduces pressure on external outcomes and allows more focus on internal consistency. Eventually, being becomes less about effort and more about familiarity. The internal state feels more natural, less forced. Seeking still exists in the background at times, but it no longer dominates the entire experience. There is more balance between movement and presence. In this way, shifting from seeking to being is about moving from a state of constant pursuit to a state of internal stability that supports movement without emotional dependence on outcomes. The feeling of already having it is not about pretending or forcing yourself into a mental image that feels disconnected from reality. It is a subtle internal shift where the desire is no longer experienced as something far away, but as something that is already included in your sense of self. This does not mean external circumstances change instantly, but the way your mind relates to those circumstances begins to change first. Most people experience desire as distance. They want something, and in that wanting, they automatically place it in the future. That future placement creates separation. The mind keeps saying, "not yet," even when progress is happening. This constant sense of "not yet" is what keeps the experience of lack active in the present moment. When someone begins to feel as if it is already done internally, that sense of distance starts to soften. The mind is no longer constantly reaching forward. Instead, it begins to rest in a different assumption. That assumption is not based on external proof, but on an internal feeling of completion. It is quiet, not emotional excitement, but more like settled acceptance. This feeling is important because the mind organizes perception around what feels true in the present moment. If something feels incomplete, the mind continues to look for what is missing. If something feels already settled internally, the mind begins to interpret experiences differently. The same external situation is seen through a different internal lens. Feeling it as already done does not mean ignoring reality. It means not emotionally depending on reality to confirm your internal state. There is a separation between what is observed and how you define yourself in relation to it. That separation creates stability because identity is no longer constantly shifting based on external conditions. When the mind is in a state of "not yet," every delay feels meaningful. Time feels like a gap that needs to be crossed, but when the feeling shifts to "already," time feels less like a barrier and more like unfolding. The urgency reduces because the outcome is no longer emotionally treated as missing. This internal shift also changes attention. Instead of focusing on how far something is, attention begins to move toward how aligned you are internally with the idea of it. This does not remove awareness of goals, but it changes the emotional weight attached to them. They feel less like absence and more like direction. The feeling of already having it is closely connected to internal identity. If someone still sees themselves as someone who is trying, then even strong desires feel slightly out of reach. But if the internal identity begins to shift towards someone who already has or already embodies, the quality, the emotional tone changes. It becomes more stable. This stability is not created by external change but by internal acceptance. The mind begins to relax its constant questioning. Instead of repeatedly asking when or how, there is a quiet sense of familiarity with the idea. That familiarity is what reduces emotional resistance. Many people misunderstand this and think it is about forcing belief. But forcing belief creates tension. The feeling of already having it is not forced, it is allowed. It is more like gently stepping into a different internal assumption and staying there long enough for the mind to become familiar with it. At first, this can feel slightly unfamiliar because the mind is used to checking external reality for confirmation. It may still look for evidence that matches the old state, but if the internal feeling is consistently returned to, the mind slowly begins to accept it as a new reference point. When this internal feeling becomes more stable, decisions start to change naturally. A person no longer acts from lack or urgency as much. There is less emotional pressure behind actions. Instead of trying to reach something from a distance, actions begin to feel like continuation of an internal state. This shift also affects emotional reactions to external events. Situations that previously created anxiety or doubt may feel less intense, not because the situation changed, but because the internal interpretation of it has changed. The mind is no longer interpreting everything through the lens of absence. The feeling of already having it also reduces overthinking. When something feels unresolved internally, the mind keeps trying to solve it mentally. It loops through possibilities, questions, and scenarios. But when there is internal completion, the need for constant mental processing reduces. This does not mean challenges disappear. It means the emotional response to them changes. Challenges are no longer seen as proof that something is missing, but as part of ongoing experience. That difference in interpretation is what stabilizes the internal state. Over time, this feeling becomes less about a conscious practice and more about a natural background state. It is not something constantly reminded or repeated, but something that is quietly present in the way you relate to yourself and your direction. The key point is that the mind responds more to what is felt as real now than what is logically desired for later. So, when the internal feeling shifts to already having, the mind begins organizing thoughts, attention, and behavior around that assumption. This is how internal alignment begins to influence external experience gradually, without force or urgency. What most people miss about this whole idea is that the feeling isn't something dramatic or emotional all the time. It's not about forcing excitement or pretending you're in a different life. It's much quieter than that. It's more like the absence of internal arguing with your own desire. When there is no constant debate inside you about whether something is possible or not, the mind starts to settle into a different rhythm. Normally, desire creates tension. You want something, and at the same time, your past experience or current situation contradicts it. So the mind keeps flipping between hope and doubt. That back and forth is what keeps the desire feeling distant. It's not the desire itself that creates suffering, it's the inner conflict around it. When people talk about already having it, what they are really pointing toward is the reduction of that conflict. It's not about denying reality or ignoring what is in front of you. It's about not letting what is in front of you define what is possible for you internally. There is a difference between observing your situation and identifying with it. The mind is always trying to complete unfinished loops. If something feels incomplete, it keeps returning to it in the form of thoughts, worries, or imagination. That's why when you really want something, it often shows up in your mind repeatedly. The repetition is not random, it's the mind trying to resolve emotional incompleteness. When the feeling shifts, what changes is that sense of incompleteness. The desire is still there, but it no longer feels like something missing from your identity. It feels more like something unfolding in its own direction. That small internal shift reduces mental pressure significantly. Another important part is that the brain learns through familiarity, not just through logic. If something feels familiar emotionally, the brain treats it as more normal, even if it hasn't fully appeared in physical form yet. That's why repeated emotional states are so influential. The mind trusts repetition of feeling more than occasional bursts of belief. This is also why forcing it doesn't work long term. If you try to jump straight into a feeling that is too far from your current inner state, the mind rejects it because it doesn't match anything it has experienced consistently. That creates resistance, and resistance pulls you back into the old pattern. So the actual shift is gradual. It starts with small moments where you are not fully in doubt, not fully in lack, just neutral. Those neutral moments are more powerful than they seem. They are the beginning of loosening the old emotional structure. Over time, those moments can extend and become more stable. Another layer of this is attention. Whatever you keep giving attention to becomes emotionally louder in your mind. If your attention is constantly on absence, delay, or comparison, the feeling of lack becomes stronger. But if your attention occasionally rests on possibility without forcing certainty, the emotional tone begins to soften. It's also important to understand that the external world doesn't immediately mirror internal change in a direct or instant way. There is always a delay. That delay is where most people lose patience and fall back into old thinking. They assume nothing is happening internally because nothing has changed externally yet. But internally, what actually shifts first is interpretation. The same situation starts to feel different. Things that used to feel heavy may feel slightly less intense. Thoughts that used to trigger strong emotional reactions may start to lose some of their charge. That's usually the first sign that something is changing. The already having it feeling is not about denying the gap between where you are and what you want. It's about not emotionally living inside that gap. You can acknowledge the gap logically without letting it define your inner state. That distinction is very important. When someone starts living less in emotional dependence on outcomes, their actions naturally become more stable. They stop overchecking, overanalyzing, and overcorrecting every step based on fear. Instead, they begin to move in a more consistent way, even if results are not immediate. Over time, this consistency creates a different experience of time itself. Instead of feeling like everything is delayed or not happening fast enough, there is more patience without frustration. Not passive waiting, but steady movement without internal pressure. What changes most deeply is not the external situation at first, but the relationship you have with uncertainty. Uncertainty stops feeling like a threat to your identity. It becomes part of the process instead of something that needs to be immediately resolved. That shift alone changes how you carry yourself in daily life. You become less reactive to small changes, less emotionally dependent on short-term outcomes, and more stable in how you interpret your path. That stability is what eventually supports clearer decisions and more consistent action over time. When you go deeper into this idea, you start to notice something subtle. Most of the struggle is not about the desire itself, but about the internal story attached to it. The mind keeps building narratives around why something is far, why it is delayed, or why it has not happened yet. Those narratives feel like truth, but they are actually just repeated interpretations layered on top of the present moment. The feeling of already having it begins to shift that narrative structure. It doesn't erase goals or wishes, but it reduces the emotional storytelling around them. Instead of constantly rehearsing, "I don't have it yet," the mind slowly starts to quiet that loop. And when that loop weakens, the desire stops feeling like pressure and starts feeling like direction. There is also something important about how the mind confuses repetition with reality. If you repeatedly think in a certain emotional tone, the mind begins to assume that tone is your identity. So if the dominant internal tone is lack, waiting, or comparison, it becomes the default lens for everything. Even good things get filtered through that lens and feel temporary or incomplete. When the internal tone shifts even slightly towards stability, the interpretation of everything begins to change. Not because external reality immediately transforms, but because the inner filter is no longer fixed in the same way. You start noticing different aspects of the same situation. What once felt like nothing is happening can start to feel like something is developing. A lot of people try to change their life by focusing only on action, but they don't realize that action is always influenced by internal state. If the internal state is heavy with urgency or doubt, even productive action feels scattered. It may look active on the outside, but internally it lacks consistency. That inconsistency is what slows down momentum. When the feeling shifts toward already, urgency naturally decreases. Not ambition, but urgency. There is a difference. Ambition can still exist in a calm mind. Urgency usually comes from emotional pressure. When pressure reduces, decision-making becomes clearer and less reactive. Another layer of this is self-observation. When someone is constantly checking whether something has happened yet, they are reinforcing the feeling of absence. That checking behavior keeps the mind locked in comparison between now and not yet. The more attention goes to that comparison, the more real the gap feels emotionally. When that checking reduces, even slightly, something interesting happens. The mind stops refreshing the same emotional question over and over again. And in that space, attention becomes less fragmented. You are no longer splitting yourself between current reality and imagined lack all the time. The already having it state is also closely related to trust, but not blind trust in outcomes. It is more like internal trust in your own direction. You stop needing constant external reassurance to stay steady. Even when things are unclear externally, there is a baseline stability inside. That stability changes how you handle setbacks as well. Instead of seeing them as signs of failure, they are processed more neutrally. The mind stops turning every delay into a meaning about your worth or ability. It becomes more observational instead of emotionally reactive. There is also a shift in how imagination is used. In a lack-based state, imagination often creates scenarios of delay, struggle, or comparison without intention. In a more aligned state, imagination becomes calmer. It is no longer driven by emotional tension but by quiet direction. The images in the mind feel less like fear projections and more like natural possibilities. Over time, this internal shift affects behavior in very simple ways. You may notice you hesitate less before taking action, or you don't overthink the same decisions as much. Not because you force discipline, but because the internal noise around decisions has reduced. What's often misunderstood is that this is not about replacing one thought with another. It is not about forcing positivity over negativity. It is about reducing internal contradiction so the mind is not constantly pulling itself in opposite directions. When contradiction reduces, energy becomes more available. Not physical energy alone, but mental clarity. You stop wasting so much internal space on doubt loops, comparison loops, and repetitive mental reviewing. That freed up attention naturally supports more stable movement. And slowly, the experience of time itself begins to feel different. Instead of everything feeling like it is delayed or pending, there is more sense of continuity. You are no longer mentally restarting the process every day. There is an ongoing internal thread that feels less broken. At that point, already having it is not a forced idea anymore. It becomes closer to a settled internal position where desire no longer feels like distance. It feels like something integrated into your direction, even if the external reflection is still unfolding gradually. When you put all of this together, the deeper message is actually very simple, but it takes time to really understand it in a lived way rather than just as words. Most of the struggle people experience is not because they lack effort, intelligence, or opportunity, but because their inner world and outer expectations are constantly out of alignment. They want something in life, but internally they are still carrying the emotional weight of not having it. That split creates tension, and that tension becomes the background feeling they live with every day. What changes everything is not forcing the outer world to move faster, but slowly changing the internal position you are operating from. When the inner state is rooted in not yet, everything naturally feels like delay, even if progress is happening. When the inner state begins to soften into already, even in a quiet and subtle way, the emotional experience of life starts to change first. And that change in experience is what eventually influences decisions, behavior, and consistency over time. It is important to understand that this is not about denying reality or pretending that circumstances are different than they are. It is about no longer letting current circumstances define your entire identity or emotional state. You can be aware of where you are without being emotionally trapped inside it. That separation is where clarity begins to form. Without that separation, every situation feels personal, heavy, and final. With that separation, situations become temporary and interpretive instead of absolute. Another important point is that the mind is always trying to make sense of repetition. Whatever emotional state you repeat most often becomes your default lens, even if you do not consciously choose it. So if the mind has been repeatedly experiencing doubt, waiting, or comparison, it will naturally continue to recreate those patterns until something interrupts that cycle. That interruption does not come from force alone, but from a different way of being consistently introduced and gently maintained. When the internal state begins to shift, it rarely feels dramatic at first. It is usually very subtle. You may notice less emotional reaction to things that used to feel intense. You may notice that certain thoughts do not hook you as strongly as before. You may notice small moments of neutrality where there used to be tension. These are not small signs in reality. They are the beginning of internal restructuring. But because they are quiet, most people overlook them. Over time, those quiet shifts begin to accumulate, and as they accumulate, the emotional tone of your life changes. You are not constantly pulled into the same mental loops. You are not as emotionally dependent on immediate results. You begin to think with more space and less pressure. That space is what allows clearer decisions to form without forcing them. Eventually, what once felt like a constant gap between you and what you want starts to feel less emotionally charged. The desire is still there, but it no longer feels like something missing from your identity. It becomes something you are moving with, rather than something you are chasing. That difference is subtle, but it completely changes the quality of your experience. And at some point you start to realize that the external world was never responding to your stress or urgency, it was responding to your consistency. Not just consistency in action, but consistency in inner direction. The mind stops rebuilding the same emotional foundation every day and starts operating from a more stable internal reference point. That stability is what allows life to feel less fragmented. The most important realization in all of this is that you are not waiting for a new life to start. You are gradually stepping out of an old internal pattern that made life feel delayed, divided, and uncertain. As that pattern loosens, your experience of reality begins to feel more continuous and less emotionally heavy. And in that continuity, things begin to unfold in a way that feels less like chasing and more like allowing. Not because effort disappears, but because effort is no longer driven by internal conflict. It becomes calmer, clearer, and more aligned with how you actually see yourself in the present moment.